The American Revolution is often remembered as a clash of armies and ideals, a struggle fought in open fields and forest clearings across frozen rivers and fortified towns. Muskets fired in disciplined volleys, cannons roared over stone walls, and banners bearing lions and eagles clashed beneath the smoke. Yet behind this familiar story of bayonets and battles was another, quieter conflict. One that unfolded not in the chaos of the battlefield, but behind wooden stockades, within makeshift prison camps and aboard hulking ships anchored in harbors. It was a struggle measured not by territory gained or armies destroyed, but by the way captives were treated and the philosophies those decisions revealed about what this new republic was trying to become. During the 8 years of war between 1775 and 1783, tens of thousands of soldiers on both sides were taken prisoner. They were captured in sieges, rounded up after failed assaults, or surrounded after long marches through hostile territory. Some were seized after battles that lasted hours, others after campaigns that stretched for months. These men entered captivity expecting misery. The traditions of 18th century warfare, shaped by centuries of European conflict, offered little comfort to the captured. Prisoners were often crammed into filthy pens with little food or water, their rations withheld, as leverage for ransom or exchange. Many died of disease, malnutrition or exposure long before they could return home. British officers warned their troops that being taken by the rebels would mean torture or starvation, that a colonial uprising could not possibly adhere to the gentlemanly rules of war that European powers claimed to follow. But the revolution was never just about replacing one king with another. For the men leading it, Washington, Adams, Franklin, and countless others, it was a chance to prove that a government founded on principles could fight a war without losing its soul. Every decision, even about prisoners, carried weight, far beyond the immediate moment. George Washington, Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, understood this deeply. He believed that the treatment of prisoners was a reflection of the very ideals the revolutionaries claimed to defend. If they descended into cruelty, if they starved and humiliated those they captured, they would hand Britain the proof it needed to brand the rebellion as savage and illegitimate. If instead they treated prisoners with humanity and dignity, they could demonstrate that the American cause was not only just, but civilized, worthy of recognition from the monarchies and courts of Europe whose support was desperately needed. This calculation was not merely philosophical, it was strategic. Britain was a global empire with a vast professional army and navy, and the rebellion's success depended on foreign alliances. France, in particular, watched closely. Reports of massacres or brutal prison conditions would poison diplomatic channels and make potential allies cautious. Conversely, news that American captors were feeding, clothing, and even compensating their prisoners could shift opinion and build sympathy for the revolutionary cause. Every loaf of bread shared with a captured enemy was, in a sense, a message sent across the Atlantic, a declaration that this was not a mob uprising, but a nation in the making. The scale of captivity during the Revolution made this struggle more than symbolic. By some estimates, more than 20,000 British soldiers, Hessian auxiliaries and loyalists spent time as prisoners in the colonies. Thousands of Continental soldiers, too, languished in British hands, many aboard infamous prison ships anchored in New York Harbor, where disease claimed lives by the hundreds. Each camp, each exchange, and each policy decision became part of a broader contest over legitimacy and reputation. Even among ordinary people, the question of how to treat captives touched on deeper questions of identity. Farmers and tradesmen, drafted into service, suddenly found themselves guarding the same red-coated soldiers they had once feared on the battlefield. Communities were asked to provide food and firewood, not just for their own militias, but for the men who had burned their towns and seized their crops. It was a bitter irony, and yet many complied, motivated by a belief, sometimes grudging, sometimes sincere, that the revolution had to be better than the empire it opposed. In this way, the war behind the fences mirrored the one fought with muskets and cannon. It was a test of endurance, of will, and of ideals. The men who stood guard over captured enemies were not just jailers, they were custodians of a young nation's moral character. And for many of the prisoners who stepped off the battlefield expecting hatred and cruelty, what they found instead, food shared despite scarcity, medical care offered despite resentment, and a basic level of respect, would leave a deeper impression than any musket volley ever could. The revolution was not only a fight for independence, it was a proving ground for the idea that power, even in war, could be tempered by principle, and that how a nation treated those it had defeated would speak volumes about the kind of republic it intended to build. For the soldiers of King George III, the American war was supposed to be a brief and decisive campaign. The red-coated regulars who crossed the Atlantic were professionals, disciplined, seasoned, and certain of their superiority over the ragged militias that had taken up arms in the colonies. Their German allies, the Hessian auxiliaries from Hesse-Kassel and Brunswick, shared that confidence. They had fought across Europe and believed that crushing a colonial rebellion would be routine work, a campaign finished before the ink dried on their contracts. Yet the war dragged on, and by the winter of 1776, that confidence had begun to falter. The humiliations that followed, first at Trenton on December 26th, then again at Princeton days later, would shake their sense of invincibility and confront them with an even stranger reality, that defeat in America did not end with chains or starvation, but with treatment far more humane than they had ever imagined. The morning of December 26, 1776, broke cold and grey over the small town of Trenton, New Jersey. Colonel Johann Rohl's Hessian garrison, numbering around 1,400 men, had spent Christmas night celebrating and drinking, unaware that General George Washington and his frostbitten troops were marching through the snow and ice of the Delaware River. Washington's gamble was desperate. The Continental Army had suffered defeat after defeat, its morale near collapse, its enlistments about to expire. Victory at Trenton was more than a tactical objective. It was a last chance to prove the revolution still had a pulse. When dawn broke and the Americans attacked, the Hessians were caught off guard. The battle was brief, chaotic, and devastating. Within an hour, the pride of Rohl's force had been crushed. Nearly 900 Hessians laid down their arms and surrendered to an enemy they had dismissed as rabble only weeks before. For many of them, that moment was the lowest point of their lives. Hessian soldiers were professionals, and to surrender, especially to a rebel militia, was considered an indelible shame. They expected ridicule, mistreatment, perhaps even execution. Some officers reportedly contemplated suicide rather than endure the humiliation of capture. Yet as they were marched from the battlefield, something unexpected happened. They were not beaten or spat upon. No jeering crowds pelted them with stones. Instead, Continental soldiers distributed food and blankets. Washington himself had issued strict orders. Prisoners were to be treated with dignity, their persons and property respected. "Treat them with humanity," he wrote, "and let them have no reason to complain of our copying the brutal example of the British Army." A week later, on January 3, 1777, another blow struck British pride. At Princeton, Washington's army again outmaneuvered its enemy, defeating troops under Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mahood and capturing nearly 200 more British regulars. Once again, the captured expected fury and contempt, and once again they were met with an unexpected civility. They were given food, medical care, and shelter from the bitter winter cold. Many would later write home in disbelief, describing the curious mercy of their captors, who often lacked sufficient rations for themselves, yet shared what little they had. For the Hessians especially, the experience was bewildering. They had been told they were fighting savages, rebels with no respect for the customs of civilized war. Yet here they were, marched into captivity with honor, allowed to keep their personal belongings, even receiving payment for certain types of labor during their internment. Officers were sometimes granted parole, their word of honor enough, to allow them to live in towns rather than behind fences. In one remarkable case, Hessian musicians captured at Trenton were invited to perform for American officers, their music becoming a curious bridge between enemies. The psychological effect of this treatment was profound. It softened the image of the Continental cause in European eyes and sowed doubt among enemy ranks. Some captured Hessians chose not to return to Europe when the war ended, settling instead in the land where they had been treated with a humanity they had not expected. Others wrote letters home that would be read aloud in Hessian villages, describing their captors not as barbarians, but as disciplined, principled soldiers. British prisoners, too, admitted in private correspondence that their expectations of cruelty had been wrong. The battles of Trenton and Princeton were military victories, but they were also moments of moral theatre. Washington understood that every prisoner fed, clothed, and treated with respect was another argument for the legitimacy of the American cause. The very soldiers who had come to America expecting to crush a rebellion found themselves astonished, not just by defeat, but by the character of those who had defeated them. In a war fought over ideals as much as independence, this unexpected kindness became a weapon more powerful than any musket, one that turned humiliation into reluctant respect and transformed captives into unlikely witnesses for the revolution's humanity. In the Europe of the 18th century, war was governed by customs that were brutal even when they were considered civilized. Prisoners of war were often little more than bargaining chips, their lives valued not for their humanity, but for the price they could fetch in ransom or exchange. Captured soldiers might languish for months or years in rotting cells, half-starved and diseased, their captors indifferent so long as they could be traded for their own men. In some campaigns, prisoners were paraded through enemy cities as trophies, stripped of dignity and subjected to public humiliation. Others were impressed into labor gangs or forcibly conscripted into foreign armies. Even among the great powers that prided themselves on their civilized conduct, neglect and cruelty were considered acceptable tools of war. In this world, a soldier who surrendered expected misery as the price of survival. British troops and their Hessian allies carried these expectations with them across the Atlantic. Officers warned their men that capture by the American rebels would mean unspeakable suffering. British newspapers and parliamentary debates were filled with accusations that the colonists were lawless and savage, incapable of honoring the conventions of European warfare. Loyalist pamphlets described American militias as mobs, farmers and shopkeepers with muskets who lacked discipline and knew nothing of the rules of war. The implication was clear. To be taken prisoner by such people would be to fall into barbarism. Stories circulated in British camps of prisoners being beaten, scalped, or left to die in chains. The image was designed to stiffen resolve and discourage surrender, to make soldiers believe that resistance to the last breath was preferable to capture. But the war they found in America did not follow the scripts they had been taught to expect. The rebels who faced them were not mercenary bands fighting for pay, nor were they marauding mobs bent on vengeance. They were men fighting for a set of principles: liberty, self-government, and the idea that a new nation could be built on laws rather than the whims of monarchs. Those principles shaped the way they fought, and they also shaped the way they treated those they defeated. George Washington, who had seen firsthand how British forces treated captured colonists during the French and Indian War, was determined that the revolution would not descend into the same cruelty. From the very beginning of the conflict, he issued clear orders that prisoners were to be treated with humanity, fed as well as resources allowed, and protected from abuse. This commitment often came at a cost. The Continental Army was chronically undersupplied, its soldiers frequently hungry, poorly clothed, and unpaid. In such conditions, it would have been easy, even understandable, for captured British or Hessian soldiers to be neglected or mistreated. Yet Washington insisted that discipline and principle must prevail. His reasoning was twofold. First, he believed that cruelty would undermine the moral foundation of the revolution and tarnish its cause in the eyes of the world. Second, he understood that every prisoner treated humanely was a silent ambassador to Europe, a living refutation of British propaganda that painted the colonists as savages. As a result, many captured soldiers found their expectations overturned in ways that left them disoriented. They were given blankets when Continental troops themselves went without. They received medical attention even when supplies were scarce. Officers were allowed to keep their sidearms as a gesture of respect, and enlisted men were often permitted to write letters home. In some camps, prisoners were even granted limited freedom of movement, trusted not to escape because their captors believed honor bound them to their word. Letters and diaries from captured soldiers reveal how deeply this treatment shook their assumptions. British Lieutenant James Hale wrote in early 1777 that he had expected barbarous treatment, but was instead entertained with civility and provision. A Hessian sergeant taken at Trenton confessed his astonishment that the rebels fed us as if we were their own. Such accounts circulated widely, carried back to Europe in correspondence or retold by exchanged prisoners, and they began to erode the image of the American army as an undisciplined mob. This was not to say that every prisoner's experience was humane. Supplies could fail, guards could be cruel, and local resentment sometimes flared into violence. But the official policy, set from the top and carried out with remarkable consistency, remained rooted in the belief that the revolution had to demonstrate its moral superiority. In a conflict where the Americans were outmatched in wealth, manpower, and naval power, the way they treated their captives became another form of resistance, one that struck not at British armies, but at British narratives. The surprise many prisoners felt was more than just relief. It was a realization that the war they were fighting was not simply a rebellion, but a revolution, one that sought to redefine not only politics and governance, but also the ethics of war itself. And in that revelation, the very men sent to suppress the uprising found themselves forced to reconsider who truly held the claim to civilization. George Washington understood, perhaps better than any other man in the Continental Army, that the war for independence could not be won by force of arms alone. The colonies were outmatched in almost every measurable category: manpower, artillery, cavalry, and above all, money. Britain's military machine was one of the most powerful on earth, commanded by experienced generals and supplied by a vast empire. The Continental Army, by contrast, was a patchwork force of volunteers and short-term enlistees, often barefoot, ill-equipped, and on the verge of starvation. Washington's greatest weapon was not the musket or the cannon. It was the moral authority of the cause he represented. If the revolution was to endure, it had to prove itself worthy of victory in the eyes of the world. And nowhere was that more evident than in how it treated those it captured. From the earliest days of the conflict, Washington recognized that legitimacy was as critical as strategy. The American rebellion needed foreign allies, particularly France, to stand any chance of defeating Britain. European monarchies were watching closely, and they would never risk aiding a cause that appeared lawless or barbaric. For Washington, the revolution's reputation was a battlefield of its own, and the treatment of prisoners became one of the clearest ways to win that fight. He issued orders that captured British and Hessian soldiers were to be treated with dignity, provided food and medical care, and protected from abuse. These instructions were not symbolic gestures. They were deliberate acts of statecraft, aimed at shaping how the revolutionaries would be perceived far beyond the battlefields of North America. This policy was not easy to maintain. The Continental Army itself was often desperate for supplies. Soldiers marched without shoes, wrapped their feet in rags, and boiled leather belts for sustenance during the worst winters. Entire regiments went weeks without pay, and many were reduced to scavenging for food in the countryside. And yet, Washington demanded that British and Hessian prisoners be fed and clothed, even if it meant his own men went without. At Valley, forged during the winter of 1777-78, as his troops suffered from disease and hunger, Washington still ensured that captured enemies received regular rations and basic medical treatment. It was a decision that angered some of his soldiers and baffled foreign observers, but for Washington it was a necessary sacrifice. The revolution could not claim the moral high ground if it treated prisoners as the British had treated captured Americans, crammed into fetid prison ships where thousands perished from disease and neglect. Washington's stance also had a practical dimension. He believed that humane treatment of prisoners would encourage surrender and reduce resistance on the battlefield. If British soldiers believed they would be treated well, they were less likely to fight to the death and more likely to lay down their arms when defeat was inevitable. Moreover, treating prisoners with dignity set a standard that Washington hoped would be reciprocated. He sent word to British commanders that American captives should receive the same humane care that their soldiers received, a principle rooted as much in tactical pragmatism as in moral conviction. His policy produced results that extended beyond immediate military considerations. Reports of fair and even generous treatment spread quickly. Captured Hessians wrote home describing the surprising kindness of their captors. Some British officers admitted privately that the Americans had upheld the chivalric ideals of war more faithfully than their own empire. These accounts circulated in European courts, softening skepticism about the American cause and laying the groundwork for diplomatic breakthroughs. When France formally allied with the colonies in 1778, it was not only because of battlefield victories, but also because the revolutionaries had shown themselves capable of governing and conducting war in a manner that aligned with European notions of legitimacy and order. There was also a deeper, more philosophical dimension to Washington's policy. He believed that the revolution was not simply a struggle to replace one government with another. It was a test of whether a society built on liberty and rights could conduct itself with restraint even under the pressures of war. The new republic's credibility depended on demonstrating that power could be exercised without cruelty, that victory could be pursued without abandoning principle. In treating his enemies with dignity, Washington was proving, to his soldiers, to his enemies, and to history, that the revolution was more than a rebellion. It was the birth of a nation that sought to embody the ideals it proclaimed. In the long run, Washington's gamble paid off. The humane treatment of prisoners became a hallmark of the Continental Army and a source of pride for the new republic. It distinguished the revolution from countless other uprisings that had descended into vengeance and brutality, and it left a legacy that would influence American military policy for generations. In a war where muskets could not match British firepower, Washington chose a weapon far stronger, the power of example, and it was that weapon, wielded with patience and conviction, that helped turn a fragile rebellion into a credible nation. The British defeat at Saratoga in October 1777 marked one of the most decisive turning points of the American Revolution. It was not merely a military setback, but a humiliation that rippled through the British Empire and electrified the revolutionary cause. General John Burgoyne, a seasoned officer with a distinguished career, had marched south from Canada with a grand plan to sever New England from the rest of the colonies and crush the rebellion in its heartland. He had expected to sweep aside the poorly trained militias and isolate the rebellion before it could gain momentum. Instead, surrounded and outmaneuvered near the small town of Saratoga, New York, Burgoyne was forced to surrender his entire force. More than 5,800 British regulars, German auxiliaries, and loyalist troops to the Continental Army. The surrender created a logistical and political dilemma for the Americans. Suddenly, they were responsible for thousands of prisoners, men who, under the brutal customs of 18th-century warfare, expected to be confined in disease-ridden pens or locked away in crumbling jails. They anticipated neglect, starvation, and perhaps retaliation for the many atrocities committed by British forces earlier in the war. Burgoyne himself, steeped in the traditions of European conflict, prepared his men for the worst. The rebel army, he warned, lacked the resources to care for them. Many expected to die before they ever saw home again. But what followed was a reality so far removed from their fears that it became one of the most remarkable episodes of the war. Rather than imprisoning the captured soldiers in fetid camps, the Continental Congress and General Horatio Gates negotiated a remarkable arrangement known as the Convention of Saratoga. Under its terms, Burgoyne's men were to be marched southward under guard and eventually repatriated to Britain on the condition that they would not serve again in the war. Although disputes over the agreement later prevented their return, the plan reflected an intention to treat the prisoners with a level of humanity unheard of in most contemporary conflicts. The march itself became a testament to that policy. The journey south was long and grueling, stretching hundreds of miles through forests, towns, and farmland. Yet throughout the trek, the captured troops were treated with a dignity that astonished them. Guards were instructed to protect the prisoners from harassment and abuse. Communities along the route were asked to provide food and shelter. Local women brought bread and broth to the weary columns. Medical officers tended to the sick and injured. Even the most junior enlisted men received regular rations, often better than those issued to the Continental soldiers escorting them. Officers were permitted to retain their swords as a sign of respect, and some were even granted parole to travel ahead or lodge in private homes under their word of honor. The Americans also allowed the prisoners certain freedoms that defied traditional expectations. Along the way, they were given opportunities to purchase goods from local markets, and in some instances, they were provided with small amounts of pocket money to buy tobacco, ale, or other comforts. This was more than mere generosity. It was part of Washington's broader strategy to demonstrate that the new republic was guided by principles rather than vengeance. Such acts were carefully observed not only by the prisoners, but also by civilians and foreign observers, whose reports would shape perceptions of the revolutionary cause abroad. When the march concluded, the prisoners, now known collectively as the Convention Army, were settled in Virginia near Charlottesville, where they were housed in rudimentary but orderly camps. Life there bore little resemblance to the squalor of European prison facilities. The men built cabins, cultivated gardens, and established small workshops. They were permitted to stage theatrical performances, brew beer, and even teach local children their language. Some formed friendships with nearby farmers, others fell in love and married into American families. Over time, the boundaries between captor and captive blurred. The men who had once marched into battle under the Union Jack now shared meals and daily routines with the very people they had come to subdue. For many British and German soldiers, this experience was transformative. They had been told that they were fighting against savages and outlaws, yet their captors proved disciplined, principled, and humane. Letters sent back to Europe described the unexpected civility of the Americans, and these accounts helped to counter British propaganda that portrayed the rebellion as a chaotic uprising. The humane treatment of the Convention Army also served a larger purpose. It demonstrated to France and other European powers that the United States was not merely a band of insurgents, but a nation capable of conducting war according to the highest standards of civilization. In the end, the march of the Convention Army became more than a logistical necessity. It was a powerful political statement. It showed that the revolutionaries understood the stakes of the conflict were larger than military victory. They were fighting not just for independence, but for the right to define what kind of nation they would become. And by treating their defeated enemies with dignity, even when their own troops went hungry, they proved that the ideals of liberty and justice were not confined to declarations and pamphlets. They could be lived, even in the aftermath of war. The prisoners who had marched under guard from the snowy fields of Saratoga or the frozen streets of Trenton arrived in captivity, carrying with them deeply ingrained expectations. They had been told that capture by rebel forces would mean degradation and starvation, that they would be treated as criminals rather than soldiers, and that they would be left to rot in squalid pens until they could be exchanged or ransomed. Instead, many found themselves seated before meals that, by the standards of wartime America, could only be described as generous. Bread, fresh vegetables, meat, and sometimes even beer or cider appeared on the tables of men who only weeks before had marched into battle determined to crush the rebellion. The shock of this reality was profound, and the irony was unmistakable. Many prisoners were eating better than the very men who guarded them. Hessian soldiers in particular left behind accounts of their astonishment. These were professional soldiers, hardened by years of service across Europe, accustomed to campaigns where captives were left to fend for themselves or survive on crusts of bread and water. In America, however, their captors seemed determined to upend those norms. At several prison camps in Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia, local communities took an active role in supplying provisions. Women brought baskets of vegetables and loaves of fresh bread. Farmers donated livestock for slaughter. Even when supplies were scarce, efforts were made to ensure that the prisoners received meals that were balanced and nourishing. For many, it was the first time they had tasted such food since leaving Europe. The disparity between the treatment of prisoners and the conditions endured by their captors was impossible to ignore. Continental soldiers often subsisted on thin stews made from whatever scraps could be scavenged. Hardtack biscuits, sometimes so moldy they had to be soaked before they could be eaten, were a staple of their diet. Salt pork, often rancid, and meager portions of cornmeal were common fare. Many of these men had not received proper rations in weeks or even months, and some were dangerously malnourished. Yet the prisoners under their watch were served hearty meals and even allowed to supplement their diet with goods purchased from local markets using money provided by sympathetic civilians or earned through paid labor. This contrast was not lost on the prisoners, and it left a complicated impression. On one hand, they were grateful for the kindness and relieved to be treated humanely. On the other, many felt a deep sense of confusion and even guilt that they were being fed while their captors starved. Hessian soldier Johann Conrad recorded in his diary that the Americans themselves suffer want, yet give freely to those who were their enemies. Another prisoner marveled at the strange mercy of a people who would fight so fiercely on the battlefield, yet treat their foes with such care once the fighting stopped. The irony also served a larger purpose, one fully understood by Washington and the Continental Congress. By demonstrating such generosity, the revolutionaries were not merely practicing compassion, they were engaging in a subtle form of psychological warfare. Every loaf of bread shared with a prisoner undermined British propaganda that painted the Americans as savage rebels. Every bowl of stew given to a captured Hessian was a reminder that this was a conflict fought on moral ground as much as physical terrain. The stories that prisoners wrote home, describing humane conditions and even relative comfort, carried enormous weight in Europe, where public opinion about the war was still fluid and crucial alliances were being negotiated. Not everyone in the continental ranks was pleased by this policy. Letters from American soldiers occasionally reflect frustration that the enemy was eating better than they were. Some questioned why scarce resources were being spent on men who had come to destroy their homes and suppress their freedoms. But Washington's orders were clear, and they were obeyed. He believed that the revolution's ideals meant nothing if they were abandoned when tested, and few moments tested them more severely than watching hungry American soldiers guard prisoners, enjoying bread and meat. The effect of these choices extended beyond diplomacy and propaganda. For the prisoners themselves, such treatment often softened attitudes and changed perspectives. Many Hessians, once fiercely loyal to their German princes, began to see the American cause in a new light. Some even defected after their release, choosing to remain in the country that had shown them unexpected mercy. Others wrote home praising their captors, describing them as principled and humane rather than savage and lawless. These testimonies, spread by word of mouth and letter, helped shape how the revolutionary movement was perceived across the Atlantic. In the end, the meals shared across the divide of war became more than just sustenance. They were symbols of the revolution's broader struggle, a demonstration that a fledgling republic, fighting for its survival, could still find the strength to act with humanity. And in the quiet, daily rhythm of bread distributed and plates cleared, something more powerful than muskets or cannons was at work. The slow, deliberate construction of a reputation that no battlefield victory alone could secure. The decision to feed and care for captured British and Hessian soldiers was not born purely from mercy or sentiment. It was, above all, a calculated act of statecraft, one that George Washington and the Continental Congress understood could shape the outcome of the revolution as surely as any battle. From the earliest days of the conflict, American leaders recognized that they were fighting not only against British soldiers, but also against British narratives. London portrayed the rebellion as a chaotic uprising led by uneducated farmers and lawless agitators, incapable of self-government and unworthy of recognition on the world stage. The revolution, Britain insisted, was not a war between nations, but a police action against a mob. If the new republic was to survive, it had to disprove that story in the eyes of the world. The treatment of prisoners became one of the most visible and persuasive ways to do so. Europe's great powers, France, Spain, and the Dutch Republic among them, watched the unfolding conflict with intense interest. Their rulers saw in the American rebellion both a potential ally and a possible threat to the balance of power, but none were willing to commit ships, soldiers, or treasure to a cause that seemed illegitimate or uncivilized. The fledgling united. States needed foreign recognition and, even more urgently, foreign aid. Without it, the Continental Army could not hope to sustain a prolonged war against the might of the British Empire. Washington understood this reality keenly. Every action taken by the Continental forces, from battlefield conduct to the treatment of captured soldiers, would be scrutinized not just by their enemies, but by European diplomats and observers. In this context, generosity toward prisoners became a form of diplomacy. To feed, clothe, and shelter captured soldiers, even when the army itself was starving, was a deliberate signal to the courts of Versailles and Madrid. It was a way of saying, this is not a rebellion of mobs, but a war waged by a nation in formation, guided by laws, principles, and restraint. This was especially important in contrast to Britain's own behavior. Reports of horrific conditions aboard British prison ships, where thousands of captured Americans died of disease and neglect, circulated widely. These accounts shocked public opinion in Europe and made Britain appear cruel and vindictive. Against this backdrop, the Americans' humane treatment of their captives stood out even more starkly, reinforcing the image of a just cause fighting against tyranny. There were also strategic benefits closer to the battlefield. Washington knew that the promise of humane treatment could encourage British and Hessian soldiers to surrender rather than fight to the last man. If captured troops could expect proper food, medical care, and fair conditions, they were less likely to resist hopeless situations, reducing American casualties and accelerating battlefield victories. The knowledge that surrender did not mean torture or starvation could subtly weaken enemy morale, eroding their will to fight and undermining British confidence in their ability to crush the rebellion. Congress, too, understood the diplomatic power of such actions. Debates in Philadelphia reveal that lawmakers were acutely aware of how prisoner treatment might be interpreted abroad. They instructed local communities to assist in housing and feeding captives, even when it strained their already meager resources. The Continental Congress went so far as to allocate funds specifically for prisoner care, a remarkable decision for a government perpetually short on money and facing bankruptcy. This was not charity. It was investment, an expenditure aimed at buying credibility in the courts and chancelleries of Europe. The results of this strategy were tangible. Reports from captured officers describing their unexpected humane treatment reached Europe and were widely circulated. French diplomats, in particular, took note, citing the Americans' conduct as evidence that they were capable of upholding the norms of civilized warfare. When France formally recognized the United States and signed a military alliance in 1778, it was due to a complex web of strategic calculations. But the image of the Continental Army as disciplined and principled played a part in tipping the scales. Spain and the Dutch Republic, too, shifted from wary observation to cautious support, encouraged by the perception that the American cause was one worth backing. There was also a deeper ideological dimension to this approach. By choosing to treat prisoners humanely, the revolutionaries were demonstrating the values they claimed to fight for: liberty, justice, and the rule of law. If they had responded to British cruelty with equal cruelty, their revolution would have looked like a mere transfer of power, not a transformation of political order. But by showing restraint, they proved that their vision for a new nation extended even to those who had sought to destroy it. In the end, feeding and caring for prisoners was far more than an act of kindness. It was a weapon in the revolutionaries' diplomatic arsenal, one aimed not at enemy armies, but at foreign minds. And in many ways, it was one of the most effective weapons they possessed. It helped win the recognition of powerful allies, shifted the tide of global opinion, and strengthened the very legitimacy on which the revolution depended. Long after muskets had fallen silent, the memory of that generosity endured, not as a sign of weakness, but as proof that America's struggle for independence had always been about more than just breaking free from British rule. It was about proving to the world that a new kind of nation could be born. The irony of the American Revolution was nowhere more visible than in the prisoner camps scattered across the young republic, where the men tasked with guarding enemy captives often lived in worse conditions than those behind the fences. The Continental Army, chronically underfunded and perpetually short on supplies, struggled to provide its own soldiers with food, pay, or proper clothing. Guards posted to watch over British and Hessian prisoners wrote bitter letters home about empty stomachs and unpaid wages, even as the men they were assigned to supervise received regular meals, blankets, and medical care. The contrast created resentment, but it also revealed something deeper about the values and ambitions of the revolutionary cause, a determination to hold itself to a higher standard, even at great personal cost. Many of the Continental soldiers who served as prison guards were militiamen from Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. They were not elite troops or hardened professionals. They were farmers and craftsmen, called away from their fields and shops to stand watch over men who had once burned their towns and fought against their neighbors. They expected hardship, but they did not expect to see the very men who had sought to destroy their revolution receiving better treatment than they themselves enjoyed. Pay for guards was irregular and often months in arrears. Rations, when they arrived at all, were small and inconsistent. Thin cornmeal porridge, worm-ridden hardtack, and sometimes nothing more than whatever could be scavenged from nearby farms. By contrast, the prisoners under their watch were fed on a regular schedule, often with food purchased by local committees or donated by sympathetic civilians. This disparity was not an accident. Washington and Congress had deliberately prioritized prisoner welfare as a matter of policy, knowing that the world was watching. Communities along the eastern seaboard often took up collections to support the maintenance of prison camps, sending livestock, flour, vegetables, and even clothing to supplement what the government could not provide. In some cases, foreign governments, most notably France, contributed supplies or funds to ensure that prisoners were treated according to the standards expected of a civilized nation. The result was that captured British and Hessian soldiers frequently enjoyed meals of bread, meat, and vegetables, meals that their guards could only envy. The letters and diaries left behind by those guards capture a complex mix of emotions. In a letter from a Pennsylvania militiaman stationed near Lancaster in 1778, the writer complained that the enemy eat full and warm while we go hungry and cold. Another soldier from a Maryland regiment recorded that his family sent him parcels of food because the army could not supply enough to sustain him. Yet even amid these grievances, many guards expressed a grudging respect for the policy they were asked to uphold. One wrote that although he despised seeing the king's men well fed while Americans starved, he understood that such treatment speaks to the justice of our cause. The disparity had unexpected consequences for the prisoners as well. Some felt uneasy knowing that their captors suffered while they were fed. Hessian soldiers, many of them conscripts with little personal stake in the war, often expressed sympathy for the Americans assigned to watch them. A few even shared portions of their rations with guards or offered small tokens of gratitude, gestures that softened relations and fostered a level of mutual respect rarely seen in 18th century warfare. In some camps, prisoners and guards developed informal exchanges, British soldiers offering bread or tobacco in return for news, extra firewood, or simply companionship during long, uneventful watches. The decision to maintain this standard, even at the expense of American troops, was a reflection of Washington's long-term vision. He knew that the revolution was not only about defeating British forces, but also about building a new nation that could claim moral legitimacy among the world's powers. Every loaf of bread given to a prisoner while a guard went hungry was a statement, a demonstration that the principles of justice and humanity were not mere slogans, but guiding principles even in times of desperation. That message was not lost on observers in Europe, where newspapers and diplomatic reports contrasted the Americans' treatment of prisoners with Britain's notorious prison ships, where American captives died in droves from starvation and disease. Still, the policy tested the patience and endurance of those tasked with enforcing it. Some soldiers deserted their posts rather than continue guarding prisoners who ate better than they did. Others petitioned Congress for back pay or reassignment. Yet many stayed, driven by duty or by the belief that their suffering served a larger purpose. They understood that in a war fought as much for ideals as for territory, the way one treated the defeated could be as important as the victories won on the battlefield. The image of half-starved militiamen standing watch over well-fed British captives is a powerful reminder of the contradictions and sacrifices that defined the Revolutionary War. It speaks to the extraordinary discipline and sense of mission that animated the Continental cause, a belief that the new nation had to prove its moral strength, even when its material strength was stretched to the breaking point, and it shows that, in the end, victory was measured not only by the defeat of British armies, but by the creation of a republic capable of living, by the ideals it claimed to represent, even when doing so came at a personal cost. Life inside the prisoner camps of the American Revolution did not always resemble the grim picture most soldiers had in their minds when they surrendered. For many British and Hessian captives, captivity evolved into something far more complex and human than they had imagined, a strange liminal existence somewhere between imprisonment and assimilation. As months turned into years, these camps transformed from temporary holding sites into living communities, with their own rhythms, routines, and social worlds. They were not simply prisons, but villages, places where men who had once marched under foreign flags now grew vegetables, brewed beer, staged theatrical performances, and even taught lessons to local children. In many cases, the boundaries between captor and captive became so porous that they almost disappeared. The transformation began out of necessity. With thousands of prisoners scattered across rural Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia, the Continental Army lacked the manpower and resources to confine them in chains or keep them locked indoors. Instead, many were given relative freedom within defined boundaries, sometimes limited to the perimeter of a camp and sometimes extending to the nearby town. They were allowed, even encouraged, to build their own shelters, plant gardens, and take part in daily chores. The result was the emergence of what contemporary observers described as prison villages, clusters of log cabins, gardens, workshops, and communal spaces that bore little resemblance to the squalid stockades of European warfare. Agriculture was central to daily life. Prisoners cultivated vegetables and herbs to supplement their rations, often producing more food than they needed. They raised chickens and goats, traded fresh produce with local farmers, and experimented with new crops they had never encountered in Europe. Brewing became another popular pursuit. Hessian soldiers, many of whom came from regions with rich beer-making traditions, set up small breweries inside the camps, producing ale and cider that they sometimes sold to nearby communities. These small industries not only improved the quality of life in the camps, but also forged unexpected economic links between prisoners and civilians. Cultural life thrived as well. Boredom and homesickness gave rise to theatrical performances, music and storytelling. Prisoners staged elaborate plays, using costumes stitched from scraps and props carved from wood. Bands formed and gave concerts for guards and townspeople. Alike, some prisoners organized schools, offering lessons in German, French, or English to local children, who often came to the camps out of curiosity and left speaking a few words of a foreign language. These exchanges softened hostility and fostered a sense of shared humanity. Relationships between prisoners and local civilians deepened over time. Many captives were employed as laborers on nearby farms, where they repaired fences, harvested, crops, and built barns in exchange for small wages or extra rations. Working side by side with Americans, they developed friendships and mutual respect. In some cases, these relationships became deeply personal. A number of prisoners married into local families, choosing to remain in America even after they were formally released. Their descendants would become part of the fabric of the communities that had once held them captive. Desertion was another outcome of this gradual blending. Some prisoners, particularly among the Hessians who had little loyalty to Britain's cause, simply walked away from their camps and disappeared into the vastness of the American countryside. They changed their names, took up trades, and started new lives. The phenomenon was significant enough that British officials complained bitterly about the difficulty of recovering all their men after the war. For many, the choice was simple. A return to poverty or conscription in Europe held less appeal than the chance to start anew in a land that had treated them with unexpected fairness. The evolving nature of captivity also changed how Americans saw their former enemies. Civilians, who had once regarded British and Hessian soldiers with hatred, began to see them as individuals rather than faceless adversaries. Children who had grown up hearing stories of redcoat tyranny now played games with prisoners' children or learned songs from them. Farmers who had cursed the invasion now relied on former enemies for labor during the harvest. The war, which had begun as a clear contest of loyalty and ideology, became more complicated in these quiet, day-to-day interactions. By the time peace negotiations began in Paris in 1782, many of the men who had entered captivity as enemies no longer thought of themselves as such. Some eagerly awaited their return home, but others dreaded it. Having built lives and relationships they were reluctant to leave behind. For them, the revolution had become more than a conflict over sovereignty. It was a chance at reinvention. The prisoner villages of the American Revolution stand as one of its most unexpected legacies. They reveal a side of the conflict that rarely appears in battlefield accounts, a world in which humanity persisted despite war's brutal logic, and where enemies could, over time, become neighbors. They show how acts of mercy and tolerance, repeated day after day, could transform fear into familiarity and captivity into community. And they remind us that even in the midst of a war for independence, the forging of a new nation was about more than battles and treaties. It was also about the quiet, steady work of building relationships, sometimes between people who had once pointed muskets at one another. When reports of the treatment of British and Hessian prisoners in America began reaching London, they caused a reaction few in Parliament had anticipated. The expectation in Britain was that the rebels, portrayed as crude, lawless, and incapable of self-government, would mete out savage justice to captured soldiers. They had been told to expect brutal reprisals, starvation, and perhaps executions. Instead, the stories that crossed the Atlantic spoke of something entirely different, of prisoners living in wooden cottages instead of fetid cells, of rations that included bread, meat, and vegetables, of gardens, schools, and even marriages. Soldiers who had marched into battle to put down a colonial uprising wrote home, describing their captors as disciplined and humane. The shock of those letters reverberated through Britain's political establishment and public opinion alike. At first, many in Parliament refused to believe the reports. They dismissed them as exaggerated or fabricated accounts intended to discredit British policy. But as more letters arrived, from officers as well as common soldiers, the evidence became too substantial to ignore. Hessian officers described being treated with courtesy and respect, even allowed to retain their sidearms as a sign of honor. British soldiers wrote of being invited to perform music, trade in local markets, and participate in cultural events inside the camps. Accounts circulated of prisoners receiving medical care from American doctors, of wounded soldiers being nursed back to health by civilians, and of men who had been enemies one day sharing meals with their captors the next. The reaction in Parliament was one of stunned disbelief, followed by growing unease. Britain had waged war under the assumption that its enemies were inferior, not just militarily, but morally and politically. Yet the conduct of the Continental Army seemed to contradict that narrative at every turn. In 1778, a heated debate erupted in the House of Commons over prisoner treatment. Some members argued that the Americans' behavior was a cynical ploy to gain international sympathy, while others, more alarmed, warned that it was working. If the colonies could present themselves as the defenders of civilized conduct, while Britain clung to older, harsher practices, the moral balance of the conflict might shift in their favor. The comparison to British treatment of prisoners, especially American captives, was unavoidable and deeply embarrassing. Nowhere was the contrast more glaring than aboard the notorious prison ships anchored in New York Harbor. These hulking, decommissioned warships, such as the HMS Jersey, became floating tombs where thousands of American prisoners died from disease, starvation, and neglect. Eyewitnesses described conditions so horrific that even some British officers privately expressed disgust. Men slept shoulder to shoulder in stinking holds infested with vermin. Food, when it was provided at all, was often rancid or crawling with maggots. Disease spread rapidly through the cramped quarters, and the death toll soared. It was estimated that more Americans died aboard prison ships during the war than on the battlefield. These conditions were an open secret in Britain, but they had been justified as a harsh necessity of war. Now, however, they were being contrasted with stories of prisoners in America who were treated not just decently, but generously. Critics seized upon this contradiction. Opposition leaders in Parliament, already critical of the government's handling of the war, accused the ministry of hypocrisy and incompetence. Pamphleteers lambasted the cruelty of British policy and warned that it was damaging Britain's reputation abroad. In one widely read essay published in 1779, a prominent Whig writer argued that the Crown's barbarity has forged the Republic's virtue, a stinging rebuke that captured the shifting mood. The embarrassment was not limited to domestic politics. Diplomats reported that France and Spain, both weighing whether to support the American cause, were closely watching how the two sides conducted themselves. Reports of humane treatment in American camps contrasted sharply with the horror stories emerging from British prison ships and holding pens, strengthening the impression that the revolution was not a rebellion against order, but a struggle for a more just political order. That perception made it easier for European governments to justify alliances with the fledgling United States, and harder for Britain to win sympathy abroad. The British public, too, began to question the government's conduct. Newspapers carried excerpts from prisoner letters and quoted parliamentary speeches criticizing the ministry. Families of British soldiers expressed relief that their loved ones were being treated well, and outrage that American captives in British hands were not. The contradiction gnawed at Britain's sense of moral superiority, a quality it had long claimed as justification for its empire. The political consequences were significant. The government faced mounting pressure to improve the conditions of American prisoners and to justify its policies in the face of growing criticism. Some reforms were attempted, but the damage had already been done. The narrative had shifted. The Americans were no longer painted simply as rebellious subjects. They were increasingly seen as principled adversaries, capable of conducting war with honor and restraint. What began as a military strategy in the colonies had become a powerful political weapon across the ocean. By choosing to treat their captives With humanity, the revolutionaries had forced Britain into an uncomfortable position, one where their own practices looked cruel and outdated by comparison. In a war fought not only for independence but for legitimacy, the power of that contrast was enormous, and in Parliament's stunned debates and the public's uneasy conscience, it was clear that the Americans had scored a victory far beyond the battlefield. By the late 1770s, the war for independence was being fought on more than one front. Muskets and cannon still decided battles on the fields of New Jersey, New York, and Virginia, but an equally important fight was being waged in the realm of ideas. America's revolutionaries understood that victory depended not only on defeating British armies, but also on shaping how the conflict was perceived, by their own citizens, by their enemies, and by the powerful nations watching from across the Atlantic. In that struggle for perception, the treatment of prisoners became one of their most potent weapons. Letters written by captured British and Hessian soldiers, full of unexpected gratitude and even admiration, became ammunition in a propaganda war that the Americans were determined to win. The Continental Congress and local committees quickly realized the political value of these first-hand accounts. Soldiers who had expected cruelty but instead received bread, medical care, and humane treatment often wrote home about their surprise. These letters, meant for family members or superiors, sometimes fell into American hands through intercepted mail or voluntary publication. Others were shared willingly by the prisoners themselves, who wanted the public, both in Britain and the colonies, to know how they were being treated. American newspapers, which had become powerful tools of political persuasion during the Revolutionary period, seized on these documents. Pages of the Pennsylvania Gazette, the Maryland Journal, and the Virginia Gazette began printing translated excerpts of Hessian diaries and letters, as well as correspondence from British officers. The effect was immediate and profound. These testimonies undermined British propaganda that painted the revolutionaries as lawless mobs. They also validated the American claim that the war was being fought not out of hatred, but out of principle. When British readers saw their own soldiers describing the Americans as disciplined, generous, and respectful, it complicated the imperial narrative that portrayed the colonies as violent and incapable of civilized conduct. For neutral powers in Europe, these same accounts provided reassurance that aligning with the American cause would not mean supporting barbarism or disorder. One widely circulated letter written by a Hessian officer captured at Trenton described his astonishment that his captors had shared their meager food supplies with him and his men, even as they themselves went hungry. Another, from a British lieutenant held in Virginia, praised the remarkable civility of local farmers who provided fresh vegetables and milk to prisoners on parole. Such stories did more to advance the American cause in European salons and drawing rooms than any battlefield victory could. Diplomats in Paris and Madrid reported that the humane conduct of the Continental Army was frequently discussed among officials and intellectuals, many of whom contrasted it with Britain's harsh treatment of American prisoners on the infamous prison ships. The contrast between these accounts and the reports of suffering aboard British hulks was not lost on anyone. American writers eagerly highlighted the difference, framing it as proof of the Revolution's moral superiority. "They starve our sons in darkness," one editorial proclaimed, "yet we feed theirs beneath the open sky." The image of ragged American soldiers sharing their dwindling rations with enemy captives became a powerful symbol, a representation of the new nation's values and its determination to rise above the cruelty of the old order. This strategy extended beyond newspapers. Pamphlets and broadsides, the era's equivalent of viral media, spread the stories even further. Some were sent to Europe with diplomatic envoys, while others circulated within the colonies to reinforce morale and commitment to the cause. The narrative was clear. America was not simply fighting for independence. It was fighting to prove that a republic based on liberty and law could act with humanity even in war. That message resonated deeply among those who had grown disillusioned with the brutality of European conflicts, where prisoners were often treated as disposable. The propaganda impact was not limited to foreign audiences. Within the colonies, the publication of prisoner accounts helped solidify support for the war among civilians who bore its burdens most heavily. Farmers who had seen their livestock requisitioned, or towns that had hosted prisoner camps at great expense, could now read the words of their former enemies praising their generosity. It turned sacrifice into virtue and reinforced the idea that the struggle was about more than taxes or trade. It was about creating a new kind of nation. For the British government, these stories were a public relations disaster. They eroded confidence in London's depiction of the conflict and complicated efforts to portray the rebels as dangerous radicals. They also deepened international sympathy for the American cause, particularly in France, where Enlightenment thinkers championed the notion that a just society must be guided by moral principles even in war. In the end, it was not only muskets and bayonets that advanced the revolution's aims, but the words of those who had once sought to destroy it. The grateful testimonies of captured soldiers, printed, reprinted, and read aloud in taverns and parliaments alike, became weapons as powerful as any artillery. They told a story Britain could not easily refute, that the American Revolution was not merely a rebellion, but a moral struggle to redefine what it meant to wage war and to build a nation. And in that struggle, kindness itself became a tool of victory. As the war stretched into its later years, the question of how captives were treated no longer flowed in just one direction. The same British officers and soldiers who had been astonished by American leniency now presided over prisons where captured. Rebels endured conditions so brutal that they became a rallying cry for the revolutionary cause. The contrast between the two approaches, one marked by restraint and humanity, the other by cruelty and neglect, grew sharper with every passing month. It was a difference that did more than stain Britain's reputation. It hardened American resolve and gave the revolution one of its most powerful moral weapons. The British Empire was unprepared for the scale of the conflict and the number of prisoners it would have to manage. As the war expanded and more continental soldiers were captured, makeshift solutions replaced proper facilities. In cities like New York, which fell under British control early in the war, warehouses, churches, and old sugar houses were converted into prisons, but they quickly became overcrowded, disease-ridden, and lethal. The worst fate of all, however, awaited those confined aboard the hulking prison ships anchored in Wallabout Bay. Among them, none would become more infamous than the HMS Jersey, a rotting former warship that would be remembered by survivors. As a floating hell, conditions aboard the Jersey were beyond anything the British public was told. Hundreds of captured soldiers, sailors, and privateers were crammed into its dark, airless holds, with scarcely enough space to lie down. The stench of unwashed bodies, stagnant water, and rotting food filled the air. Rations, when they were provided, were meager and often inedible. Hardtack crawling with maggots, salt beef so foul it was impossible to chew. Disease thrived in the confined quarters. Dysentery, smallpox, and typhus swept through the prisoners, claiming dozens of lives every week. Corpses were hauled up daily and dumped overboard, their names often never recorded. By some estimates, more Americans died aboard British prison ships than were killed in combat during the entire war. For those who survived, the memory of captivity remained seared into their minds. Many later described the experience as worse than battle. They had not surrendered to a foreign power expecting luxury, but neither had they expected deliberate neglect and cruelty. What shocked them most was not the lack of resources, but the indifference. Requests for medical care went unanswered. Complaints about spoiled rations were ignored. Guards sometimes taunted starving men by eating their meals in plain sight. And, all the while, Britain's leaders dismissed reports of suffering as exaggeration or rebel propaganda. The contrast with how the Americans treated their prisoners could not have been more striking. British soldiers who had been captured at Trenton, Saratoga, or Yorktown often recalled being fed from the same supplies that barely sustained their captors. They spoke of being given blankets in the winter, of medical attention when wounded, of respect, even in defeat. These stories were widely known by the time the horrors of the Jersey and other prison ships became public knowledge, and they sharpened the moral divide between the two sides. The Americans were fighting for liberty and conducting themselves with dignity. The British, supposedly the guardians of civilization, appeared vindictive and barbaric. This contrast was not lost on observers abroad. French and Spanish diplomats cited the treatment of prisoners as evidence of the two sides' character, using it to justify their alliances with the Continental Congress. In Paris, influential thinkers in the salons and academies pointed to the Americans' restraint as proof that Republican government could uphold the principles of humanity even in war, something many monarchies had long claimed only they were capable of. British cruelty, meanwhile, became a recurring topic in pamphlets and newspapers throughout Europe, eroding sympathy for the empire and bolstering support for the colonial cause. Within America, the stories of suffering became part of revolutionary identity. Survivors' accounts circulated in pamphlets and newspapers, their words laced with bitterness and resolve. Preachers spoke from pulpits about the moral depravity of an empire that starved and tortured prisoners while calling itself civilized. Artists painted grim depictions of the Jersey, its decks piled with corpses, its portholes leaking disease into the harbor. These images stirred public anger and strengthened the belief that the war was not only about independence, but also about justice, a battle against tyranny in its most physical form. Even some British observers recognized the damage being done. A few members of Parliament criticized the government for policies that turned captured Americans into martyrs and handed the revolutionaries a potent propaganda tool. But their voices were drowned out by those who insisted that leniency would only embolden the rebellion. The cruelty continued, and with it grew the moral chasm between the two sides. By the time the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, the memory of those prison ships and overcrowded jails had become part of the Revolution's story. A story that cast Britain not as a benevolent empire preserving order, but as a power willing to abandon its own humanity to crush a people's desire for freedom. Against that backdrop, the Americans' earlier acts of mercy shone even more brightly. In the end, the war's outcome was shaped not only by strategy and firepower, but also by how each side chose to wield power over the defeated, and in that test of character it was clear who had won. By the time the American Revolution reached its later years, the decision to treat enemy prisoners with dignity was no longer seen merely as a moral gesture. It was, as many historians now recognize, a carefully calculated weapon. One that struck not with bullets or bayonets, but with perception, memory, and reputation. The Continental Army and the leaders of the Revolution understood that wars are fought not only on battlefields, but also in minds, and that the struggle to define the character of the conflict was as important as the struggle to win territory. In this battle for narrative, humanity itself became a tool of war. The British government had relied heavily on a particular narrative to justify its actions. From the start, London insisted that the rebellion in the colonies was not a legitimate war, but a criminal uprising led by radicals and mobs incapable of governance. It portrayed the revolutionaries as dangerous, unstable, and inherently violent. Men who would, if they gained power, plunge the continent into chaos. British officials and newspapers warned that any captured soldier would face barbaric treatment at the hands of a people who lacked the discipline or morality of a civilized power. This message was not only intended for the British public, it was designed to influence European opinion and deter foreign powers from supporting the colonial cause. If the Americans could be painted as savages, no monarchy would risk aligning with them. Washington and Congress recognized this propaganda strategy for what it was, and they understood that the surest way to defeat it was not by argument, but by example. Every act of humane treatment offered to a captured soldier undermined the British narrative. Each loaf of bread shared, each wound tended, each officer allowed parole, contradicted the image of the Americans as vengeful and undisciplined. And because such acts were visible, described in letters home, reported in newspapers, recounted by exchanged prisoners, they carried far beyond the walls of any single camp. The revolutionaries turned compassion into a spectacle, and in doing so, they shifted the psychological terrain of the war. For the British soldiers themselves, this treatment had an immediate and demoralizing effect. Men who had been told they would be tortured or executed instead found themselves clothed, fed, and treated with respect. The cognitive dissonance this created could not be ignored. It raised uncomfortable questions about the righteousness of their mission and the credibility of their commanders' words. Letters from captured officers often included grudging admissions that the Americans had behaved with honor, and these letters, passed among soldiers, read aloud in taverns, and eventually published, spread doubt within the ranks of Britain's own military. The psychological impact extended far beyond the battlefield. In the courts of Europe, the contrast between British rhetoric and American behavior became a subject of intense discussion. French ministers, already inclined to support the rebellion as a way to weaken their imperial rival, were reassured that their alliance would not tie them to a movement defined by brutality. Spanish and Dutch diplomats, wary of revolution but sympathetic to its ideals, pointed to the Americans' conduct as proof that the uprising was more than an angry mob. It was a disciplined, principled movement that understood the responsibilities of power. This perception helped pave the way for the alliances, loans, and diplomatic recognition that would ultimately tip the balance of the war. The Americans themselves were aware of this psychological dimension. Washington frequently wrote about the importance of setting an example, not just for moral reasons, but for strategic ones. He knew that stories of kindness could travel as far as any courier and last longer than any victory. He also understood that this approach disarmed one of Britain's most powerful weapons, fear. By refusing to live up to the monstrous image painted by imperial propaganda, the revolutionaries robbed it of its power. Fear loses its force when the enemy behaves in ways that defy expectation. There was also a subtler effect at work, one that historians now see as pivotal. By demonstrating restraint and humanity, the revolutionaries not only gained sympathy abroad, but also strengthened their own sense of purpose at home. The treatment of prisoners became a reflection of the ideals they were fighting for, a daily reminder that this was not a struggle for revenge, but for a different kind of world. Soldiers who might have harbored hatred for their captives were reminded that they were fighting for something larger than vengeance. Civilians who contributed food and supplies to prisoner camps participated in the revolution not just as bystanders, but as active practitioners of its values. By the end of the war, humanity had proven itself to be more than a virtue. It was a strategic asset. It shaped international alliances, eroded British morale, weakened imperial propaganda, and strengthened the ideological foundation of the new republic. It was, in essence, a weapon that cost little but accomplished much. Where muskets could fail and armies could falter, the simple act of refusing cruelty succeeded in reshaping the very meaning of the war. In doing so, the revolutionaries demonstrated a truth that remains as relevant now as it was then. Power is not always measured in the ability to destroy, but often in the strength to hold fast to one's principles, even in the face of hatred. When the last shots of the Revolutionary War were fired and the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, the United States emerged not only as an independent nation, but as a state shaped by a profound experiment in how war could be waged. The decision to treat enemy prisoners with dignity, a choice born of both principle and strategy, left an imprint far deeper than anyone at the time could have predicted. It shaped diplomatic relationships, influenced the nation's moral identity, and established precedents that would echo through every major conflict the United States would fight thereafter. Long after British troops had boarded ships for home and the Continental Army had disbanded, the lessons learned about mercy and restraint continued to guide the Republic's understanding of warfare and its place in the world. One of the most enduring consequences of Washington's policies was the idea that how a nation treats its prisoners reflects the nature of its government. For the generation that built the United States, this was not an abstract principle, but a lived reality. They had seen firsthand how British cruelty on prison ships like the Jersey had galvanized public outrage and strengthened the revolutionary cause. They had witnessed how humane treatment of captives could build diplomatic bridges and win international legitimacy. And they understood that the United States, as a republic founded on ideals of liberty and justice, would be judged not just by the battles it won, but by how it exercised power when victory was already in hand. The notion that the treatment of prisoners was a test of a nation's character became part of the country's political and military DNA. This legacy was evident only a few decades later during the War of 1812. Once again, American and British soldiers found themselves on opposite sides of the battlefield, but this time the treatment of captives reflected a new standard. Both governments, shaped by the memory of the Revolution, sought to avoid the abuses that had scarred the previous conflict. Prisoners were exchanged more regularly, their rights were more clearly defined, and abuses, while they still occurred, were publicly condemned in ways they had not been before. The precedent set during the Revolution, that a republic must rise above cruelty, helped guide policy and shape public expectations of wartime conduct. The influence was even more profound during the Civil War, when the United States faced its greatest internal crisis. The conflict produced some of the most infamous examples of prisoner suffering in American history, including the horrors of Andersonville and Elmira. Yet even amid those tragedies, debates in Congress and the press often invoked the principles first articulated during the Revolution. Washington's belief that the nation's moral legitimacy depended on its treatment of captives was cited repeatedly in arguments for reform. The Lieber Code of 1863, one of the first comprehensive sets of wartime rules governing the treatment of prisoners, bore the unmistakable imprint of those earlier lessons. It emphasized humanity, proportionality, and the protection of non-combatants and captives. Ideas rooted in the Revolutionary era's insistence that power must be exercised with restraint. The legacy extended beyond America's borders as well. The humane treatment of prisoners during the Revolution was closely studied by European military theorists and diplomats in the decades that followed. It influenced the development of international norms, including the early conventions that would eventually lead to the codification of laws governing prisoners of war in the 19th and 20th centuries. By demonstrating that a fledgling republic could conduct itself with restraint even under existential threat, the United States had helped redefine what civilized warfare could mean. The cultural memory of those early decisions also shaped American identity. The image of ragged continental soldiers sharing their meager rations with enemy captives became a foundational part of the nation's self-understanding, a symbol of the belief that the Republic was built not merely on force, but on principle. Generations of political leaders, military officers, and ordinary citizens drew upon that memory to frame the United States as a nation that sought to fight wars differently, not always successfully, but always with an awareness that its legitimacy rested on more than victory. Even in moments when the country fell short of its ideals, those ideals themselves continued to serve as a moral compass. The Revolutionary War was fought to win independence, but it also forged something deeper, a philosophy of power that valued humanity as a measure of strength. That philosophy would be tested again and again on the battlefields of Mexico, in the trenches of Europe, in the jungles of the Pacific, and it would not always prevail. Yet the expectation that a democratic nation must treat even its enemies with dignity has remained a constant thread in America's story. It began when a small, desperate army chose to feed and shelter the soldiers sent to destroy it, and in doing so, proved that the ideals on which the United States was founded were more than words on parchment. They were principles strong enough to guide a nation through war, shape its character in peace, and influence the conduct of nations far beyond its shores. When veterans of the American Revolution looked back on their years of service, many remembered not just the crack of muskets, the sting of winter marches, or the chaos of battle. What lingered most deeply in their memories were moments of unexpected humanity, times when, instead of hatred and vengeance, they encountered something far more disarming: kindness. For captured British regulars and Hessian auxiliaries, the most enduring impressions of the war were often not forged on the battlefield, but around shared meals, humble conversations, and gestures of dignity that seemed to defy the logic of war itself. It was in those quiet, improbable scenes where enemies broke bread instead of bones that the revolution revealed its deepest victory, that a republic built on ideals could fight fiercely and still hold fast to its humanity. The meals that prisoners shared with their captors were more than just sustenance. They were a living symbol of the values that had inspired the revolution in the first place. In a world where surrender often meant degradation or death, to be fed and treated as a fellow human being was astonishing. Prisoners recalled how, even in camps where food was scarce and continental soldiers themselves were half-starved, rations were still distributed evenly. Guards and captives alike ate the same coarse bread, the same stew thickened with turnips, and beans, the same salted meat stretched thin over too many mouths. In some camps, prisoners were invited to share meals in the homes of local families, where conversations were halting and clumsy, a mixture of broken German, English, and gestures, yet deeply human. These shared meals were small acts of defiance against the brutality of war, moments that said more about the character of the American cause than any battlefield proclamation. For many prisoners, those moments challenged everything they had been told about the rebellion. British propaganda had painted the colonists as wild and vengeful, incapable of civilized conduct. Yet here they were, not only sparing their enemies, but sitting beside them at dinner tables. Hessian officers wrote home in disbelief, describing how they were treated as guests rather than foes, while common soldiers recalled the bewildering sight of American families inviting them into their homes for Sunday supper. Some of these men, hardened by years of campaigning in Europe, admitted that they had never seen such treatment from any enemy before. The very people they had been sent to subdue were offering them bread. The effect of these encounters was profound and lasting. They changed perceptions, not just of the Americans, but of what the war itself was about. For many prisoners, the revolution stopped being merely a colonial uprising and became something larger, a struggle rooted in principles that transcended borders and loyalties. The kindness they experienced forced them to see their captors, not as rebels or traitors, but as people fighting for ideals worth respecting. Some Hessian soldiers later chose to stay in America after the war, building new lives in the country where they had first been captives. Others, upon returning to Europe, carried stories of unexpected mercy that helped reshape how the world viewed the fledgling republic. These stories did not remain confined to memory. They entered the broader mythology of the Revolution, becoming part of the narrative that the new United States told about itself. They were recounted in taverns and classrooms, woven into sermons and political speeches, and invoked whenever the nation wrestled with questions about how to wield its power. The image of a ragged continental soldier sharing his meager rations with a man who had once aimed a musket at him became a defining metaphor for the Republic's founding ideals. It spoke to the belief that strength was not measured solely in victories won or enemies vanquished, but in the ability to rise above hatred and embody the values one claimed to fight for. There was a deeper message in all of this, one that extended far beyond the war itself. The Revolution's approach to captivity demonstrated that a society could be both resolute and compassionate, both fierce and fair. It proved that victory did not have to come at the expense of humanity, and that ideals could survive even under the most difficult circumstances. That lesson would resonate long after the war ended. It would shape how the United States approached diplomacy, how it wrote its laws, and how it defined its place in the world. It became a benchmark against which future generations would measure themselves, a standard to strive for, even when the realities of war and politics made it difficult to reach. For the men who once wore the king's red coat, or the Landgrave's blue, the Revolution was not just a chapter of defeat, it was a revelation. They entered captivity expecting humiliation, and left it with a story they would tell for the rest of their lives. A story not of guns and flags, but of bread shared across lines of battle, of dignity offered where none was required, and of a young republic proving that power rooted in ideals could prevail. In those small human gestures lay the Revolution's quietest triumph, a victory not only over an empire, but over the brutal logic of war itself.